Step away from that door and keep your hands where I can see them. Nobody around here dresses like that unless they're up to no good. Those were the first words Officer Wade Kessler ever spoke to me. And even now, years later, I can summon the exact temperature of that night against my face. It was a Thursday in late November, a little past 8, the kind of cold Elderton gets when the wind comes off the reservoir and finds the seams in whatever you're wearing. I stood on the granite steps of the Elderton Public Library, a canvas tote of returned books heavy on one shoulder, a paper cup of vending machine coffee going lukewarm and bitter in my hand. I wore a faded maroon university hoodie I'd owned for 19 years, drawstrings long gone, cuffs soft and gray, worn jeans, and running shoes that had surrendered their tread in the second year of the pandemic. I looked, I suppose, exactly like the woman a man like Kessler had already decided did not belong on those steps. What he could not have known, as he crossed the lot with one hand on his belt and his headlights throwing our two shadows across the pavement like accusations, was that the woman in the shabby hoodie he'd chosen to hunt was the Honorable Naomi Sinclair, a United States District Judge, confirmed by unanimous Senate vote, who had presided over federal cases for the better part of a decade. I had spent 22 years in courtrooms learning one thing above all. The loudest person in any room is almost always the most frightened. Fear disguises itself as authority. It puffs up, it barks, it reaches for whatever it can grip. So when Kessler shouted from the bottom of those steps, I did not shout back, did not flinch, did not do the thing my heart wanted, to name myself and watch him shrink. I set my coffee on the cold stone railing. I showed him both empty hands, palms out, fingers spread. And I waited. I am not telling you this so you will hate him. I am telling you because of what came after. Because a jury of 12 ordinary people eventually sat in a wooden box and did something this country does not do nearly often enough. And because I have come to believe, slowly and at great cost, that the only worthwhile thing to do with a wound is to turn it into a door other people can walk through. But before you walk through the door, you have to see how it was built. And it was built, at the beginning, out of a hoodie and a coffee cup and a man who had confused the weight of a badge with the shape of the truth. He was younger than his voice had led me to expect. Mid-30s, thick through the shoulders, a jaw he carried like a fist. When I did not scramble, did not stammer an apology and hurry away, I watched something shift in him. Compliance was supposed to look like surrender. Mine did not. I simply stood there, straight-spined, in the amber glow from the library doors, a woman with library books and lukewarm coffee, and let him come to me. That was the first thing that unsettled him. He had rehearsed a script in which I ran, or wept, or cursed. I was reading none of his lines. Behind the tall glass, I could see the night clerk moving between the shelves, a young man I would later know as Theo. And I remember thinking there were witnesses, there was light, that whatever this became would not happen in the dark. I did not yet understand how much I would lean on that thought. I only knew, the way you know a storm is coming before the first drop lands, that this man had already decided the ending of our encounter. My only power in the next few minutes would be to make certain the record disagreed with him. I asked you a question. Kessler climbed the steps 2 at a time, unhurried and heavy, until he stood close enough that I could smell the mint on his breath and, under it, coffee and cold nylon and the faint metal of his gear. What are you doing out here? Returning books, I said, my voice even, unhurried. The register I use from the bench when a young attorney is coming apart and needs someone in the room to stay calm so he can. The outdoor book drop is locked after 8. I was waiting for the night clerk to open the side door and take these. That's all this is. He laughed, not a warm sound. The short expelled breath of a man who's decided you're lying and enjoys catching you at it. Returning books, he repeated, turning the words over as if they were something absurd I'd invented on the spot. We had a call. Break-in at the vehicles in this lot. Somebody prowling around, trying door handles. And you match the description. I have heard those 5 words more times than I could count, and they are almost never a description of anything. A tall man, a short man, a heavy woman, a teenager, a grandfather in his church suit. The description bends until it fits whoever the officer has already chosen. It is not an observation. It is a permission slip a certain kind of man writes for himself and countersigns in the same breath. I'm going to need to see some identification, he said, the way a man closes a door. Officer, I said gently, I'd be glad to talk with you. But I'd like to understand something first. Have you observed me touch any vehicle in this lot? Have you seen me do anything unlawful at all? I was not being clever. I was being precise. My grandmother taught me precision when I was a girl. She said it was the only armor poor people were allowed to carry, because it cost nothing and no one could confiscate it. I was being precise the way the law is precise. In this state, no statute requires a person to surrender identification merely because an officer has grown curious. There must be reasonable, articulable suspicion of an actual crime. Standing on public library steps, holding library books, at closing time, is not a crime, no matter what the woman is wearing, no matter what color her hands are in the porch light. But precision, to a man who has mistaken his badge for a birthright, does not sound like law. It sounds like insolence. I watched it land. His jaw tightened, the small muscle in his cheek jumped beneath the skin. I watched him decide, in real time, that I was going to be a problem, and that he would make me pay the tax he charged all problems. "You've got a real mouth on you," he said, and unclipped the handcuffs. They made a small, cold, silver sound, like a bell rung once in an empty church. Behind the glass, Theo had gone still with a stack of paperbacks in his arms, watching. I remember thinking, with the strange clarity that descends on me at such moments, that whatever was about to happen would matter far beyond this parking lot, this night. I did not yet know how far. "Turn around," Kessler ordered. "Hands behind your back." I did not resist. I have watched enough footage in my own courtroom to know how resistance is manufactured, how the startled flinch of a shoulder, the instinctive half-turn of a frightened body, becomes a violent lunge in the wrong report. A justification written after the fact to fit whatever was already done. So I did not give him that. I turned slowly, deliberately, telegraphing every motion, and placed my hands behind my back. And I said it clearly, pitching my voice so Theo and anyone else within earshot could hear. "I am not resisting. I am complying under protest. You have no lawful basis for this." The steel closed around my wrists. He ratcheted it a full notch tighter than it needed to be. That petty cruelty of small men who want you to feel the metal bite so you understand who holds the key. It bit. A thin, bright pain wrapped my wrist bones and did not let go. I made no sound. I stood in the amber light, a federal judge in a 19-year-old sweatshirt, handcuffed for the crime of returning books, and I began, out of a lifetime of hard-earned habit, to memorize. His badge number, black digits on a silver shield. The 4-digit number stenciled on the rear quarter panel of his cruiser. The small square body camera clipped to the center of his chest, the tiny red light on its housing, blinking, blinking. The digital clock glowing green through the library window, 8:14. I gathered these the way another woman might gather scattered groceries. Quickly, completely, without drama, because details are the only witnesses that never change their story. And because in some later season of my life these would become the spine of something. "You're making a serious mistake," I told him quietly as he took my elbow and steered me down the steps toward his car. It was not a threat. It was the last courtesy I had left to offer, and I offered it plainly. "You have no idea who I am." "Save it." Kessler laughed again. He put his broad hand flat on top of my head and folded me down into the back seat the way you'd stow a bag of something you didn't much care about. "They all say that." The cruiser smelled of pine cleaner laid over something older and human. Sweat, old fear, the residue of everyone folded into that hard plastic seat before me. The molded seat was cold straight through my jeans. Through the grate that caged the back from the front, I watched the thick column of Kessler's neck as he pulled out and swung onto Franklin Street, driving a little too fast, taking the corners too hard, the way a man drives when he's performing his authority for an audience of one. And that audience is himself. He keyed his radio. "Dispatch, Unit 14. I've got one in custody at the library. Matches the prowler description. Transporting to booking. Female. Uncooperative. Uncooperative." I turned the word over in the dark. I had answered every question, shown him both open hands, turned around when told, placed my hands behind my back when told, walked where he pushed me. But in the private grammar of a man like Kessler, a black woman who knows the law and declines to grovel is, by definition, uncooperative. And I understood then, the way you understand weather without a forecast, that he was already writing the night down in his head, choosing the words that would file his violence under procedure, building the sentence that would make a locked book drop and a paper cup of coffee disappear. Then he did the thing that told me everything. He kept talking, not to dispatch, to me, over his shoulder, through the grate, in the easy, expansive voice of a man who believes he is untouchable and enjoys the sound of his own certainty. You people always want to make it complicated, he said. You could have just handed me the card. 10 seconds. Instead, you want to give me a law lecture on a Thursday night. He shook his head at the windshield. I've been doing this 9 years. I know a prowler when I see one. I don't care what's in your wallet. He said it lightly, almost cheerfully. He did not know he was talking to the one passenger in that back seat's history who would remember every syllable, repeat it, and be believed. I sat very still and let him fill the silence with rope. I did not argue with the back of his head. There was nothing to be bought there, and I have spent my life learning to spend energy only where it buys something real. So I sat still and did the thing I do best, which is think. I thought of a young public defender who had come apart in my courtroom the week before. A bright, terrified woman whose hands shook so badly she dropped her notes, and how I'd called a recess, found her by the water fountain, and told her the case is never won in the 10 seconds when everyone is watching. It is won in the 2 years of preparation nobody sees. I thought of my grandmother, Willa, who cleaned houses in Harmon County for 30 years, on her knees on other people's floors, and taught me to guard my composure the way you guard money. Because for people like us, composure was money. The only currency no one with a badge or a deed or a grudge could take. And I thought, with an unexpected ache, of how many women had sat exactly where I sat, in this kind of car, on this kind of cold night, with no title behind their name and not a single card to play. That thought did not make me afraid. It made me resolved. Because I did have the cards, all of them, and somewhere on Franklin Street, watching streetlights slide across the grate, I decided. If this man had done this to me, a federal judge who knew the statute number by heart, he had almost certainly done it to many who had no way to fight back. And I would not let the record of tonight vanish into a filing cabinet the way so many records vanish, quietly, permanently, as if they had never been written. The Elderton police station was a low brick building at the edge of downtown, its fluorescent lights buzzing like something small and angry trapped in the fixtures, the booking room smelling of burnt coffee and floor wax, and cold air blown too long through old ducts. Behind the raised intake desk sat a sergeant named Delroy Hutchins, heavy-set, late 50s, reading glasses pushed halfway down his nose, with the tired, watchful eyes of a man who had seen a great many things come through those doors and learned to trust the bad feelings that arrived unbidden in his stomach. Kessler marched me to the counter, his hand clamped harder on my elbow than any purpose required. Prowler out of the library lot, he announced to the room, loud, pleased with himself. Refused to ID. Got mouthy. Resisting. And there it was, the second lie, spoken aloud, before witnesses, layered on the first. He'd said uncooperative on the radio. Now, in the warm light of the station, with an audience, it had grown into resisting. That is how these stories fatten. Not all at once, a word at a time, each retelling braver than the last, because no one had ever made him account for the distance between them. He did not know that this time someone was counting the distance. I was. Hutchins looked at me a long moment over the top of his glasses, at the faded maroon hoodie, the worn jeans, the threadbare shoes. Then at the way I stood, spine straight, chin level, shoulders squared, the posture I have never in my life been able to set down even when it would have been safer to. Something flickered behind his tired eyes, some old instinct waking, telling him the picture did not add up. Name, he asked. There was no cruelty in it. There was almost, I thought, an apology already. I am going to remain silent, I said, meeting his eyes, until I have spoken with my attorney. And I would ask you, Sergeant, I am asking you directly, to preserve every recording associated with tonight. The body camera, the dashboard camera, the dispatch audio, all of it. I am telling you that on the record, and I am asking you to write down the exact time I told you. Hutchins's pen stopped on the intake form. Something in how I said it, the specific words, the calm certainty of a person who knew precisely which recordings existed and why each would matter, made him set the pen flat on the desk. He sat up straighter, and I watched him begin, in that instant, to be afraid of something that was not me. Kessler heard it too, and instead of going quiet, he leaned into the counter and dug faster. She's been running her mouth like this since the library, he told Hutchins, jerking his chin at me. Threatening me. Says I'm making a mistake. They coach each other on this stuff now, you know that? Learn the little phrases off the internet. Am I being detained? Articulable suspicion. He mimicked me in a high, mincing voice, and some of the words he mocked were the exact words that would, months later, be read back to him from a transcript in front of 12 people while he sat in a pressed uniform with nowhere to look. He thought he was performing competence for his sergeant. He was performing motive for a jury. Empty your pockets, Kessler said, and before I could answer, he reached into the front pouch of my hoodie himself, pulled out my slim leather wallet, and dumped its contents on the counter with the theatrical carelessness of a man who wants the room to watch him find the thing that proves him right. 2 credit cards fanned across the laminate, a little folded cash, a small photograph, worn soft at the corners, of my grandmother in her good blue dress, and a heavy card of official government stock, gold-sealed, that slid free and came to rest face-up beneath the buzzing light. Hutchins picked it up the way you pick up something you suspect will rearrange your whole evening. He read it once. He read it again, more slowly, and the color drained from his broad face like water from a cracked glass. Kessler, very quietly. What? Kessler was still riding the crest of his performance, still half-turned toward the room, still waiting for someone to hand him his applause. Hutchins turned the card and held it up so the younger officer could see the raised seal, the small photograph, the title in stark black capitals beneath it. This is a federal judge. His voice did not shake. It was worse than that. It was flat. United States District Court. Judge Naomi Sinclair. The words fell into that buzzing room, and everything went still, as if the building had drawn a breath and held it. I watched the meaning travel across Kessler's face in stages, like weather crossing a field. First blank confusion, then slow recognition, then the drowning horror of a man who has understood that the person he chose to humiliate is not the person he'd been permitted to imagine. His mouth came open. Nothing came out. And in the corner, near the door, a young officer I hadn't noticed, a rookie, 24 at most, her uniform hat still in both hands, had gone pale and rigid, looking back and forth between the gold card and Kessler with an expression I'd come to know intimately in the months ahead. The face of a person watching a lie collapse in real time and realizing, far too late, that she'd helped hold it up. Take these off, I said, turning slightly so my cuffed wrist showed above the counter's edge, the swollen red skin plain under the light. My voice did not rise. It never rises. Now, please. And then you and I are going to have a very careful conversation about what happens next. Hutchins was already coming around the desk with the key in his unsteady hand. But Kessler had not moved. He stood rooted to the tile, his own key still on his belt, and I understood he was not frozen out of shame. Not yet. Not so soon. He was frozen out of calculation. I have watched 1,000 men make that same arithmetic. The frantic, silent accounting of whether it is already too late to make a thing right, or whether the smarter play is to plant your feet, double down, and trust that the machine, which has always shielded you, will shield you one more time. I watched him choose. I watched the raw fear in his eyes go hard and cold and settle into something sullen. She still refused to identify herself, he said, to Hutchins, to the pale rookie, to the room, to himself. She was still combative. I followed procedure. That single sentence, the choice to defend the indefensible rather than say the 3 words I was wrong, was the exact moment Kessler stopped being a man who had made a mistake and became a man who had chosen a story. A distinction that would matter enormously, months later, to 12 ordinary people in a jury box, though he could not have known it. Hutchins unlocked the cuffs. I brought my hands forward slowly and looked at the deep red rings pressed into my wrists, the skin already darkening toward bruise, and I did not rub them, did not wince, would not give a single soul in that room the satisfaction of watching me hurt. I straightened the soft cuffs of my ruined hoodie. I picked my grandmother's photograph up off the cold counter and slid it gently back into my wallet, into its place behind the cards. Sergeant Hutchins, I said, I am not going to make demands of you tonight, because you are not the man who did this to me, and because I could see on your face that you knew something had gone wrong the moment I walked through that door. So I am going to ask you instead of ordering you. I am going to ask you to secure every recording, to log this booking exactly as it occurred, with no kind words shaved off the edges, and to make certain not one single frame of footage from tonight is altered or misplaced or lost. Can you do that for me?" He said that he could, with a relief I recognized, the relief of a decent man handed away to be decent inside a place that does not always reward it. Then, at the end of the hall, the captain's door opened and a man I'd come to know as Captain Roy Bellwether came out fast, tie already loosened, phone already in hand. Someone had called him at home, and he had understood in the time it took to drive across town that his small department stood at the crumbling edge of something very large. He stopped short when he saw me. He looked at my wrists. He looked at the gold card still lying under the light. And I watched a professional lifetime of instinct rearrange itself behind his eyes into a single governing word: containment. Judge Sinclair. His voice arrived wrapped in the smooth, practiced warmth of a man who has smoothed over a great many things across a long career. "Your Honor, I cannot tell you how sorry I am. This is a terrible misunderstanding. A terrible one. And I promise you it ends right here, right now. You're free to go. Of course you are. You always were. I'll have someone drive you home this instant. Anything you need. Anything at all. Let's the two of us put this behind us." He was already reaching for my elbow, gently this time, to steer me toward the front door, the quiet exit, the version of the night in which it never quite happened and no one ever stood up in the light to answer for it. I did not move. "Captain," I said, "I hear your apology, and I believe that some part of it is sincere. But I am not going to slip quietly out the back of your station tonight, and I want to be honest with you about exactly why. If I do that, if I let you drive me home in an unmarked car and we agree, the two of us, to call this a misunderstanding, then the only thing that will separate tonight from 1,000 other nights in this county is that I happen to have a card in my wallet that frightened you. That's all. And the people who don't carry that card will go right on being handcuffed on library steps, in the dark, for nothing, and no one will ever know their names. I am not willing to be the exception that lets the rule keep breathing. So here is what is going to happen instead. I am going to walk out of your station under my own power, through the front. I am going to go home, and I am going to sleep. And in the morning I am going to call an attorney, and together, in the daylight, we are going to find out exactly what happened here tonight, and exactly how many times it has happened before." Bellwether's face did something complicated and slow. He had prepared for fury, and he could have managed fury. Fury is a fire, and he knew 100 ways to smother one. What he had not prepared for was calm, and calm is far harder to contain, because there is nothing in it to grab hold of. I gathered up my canvas tote of library books. No one, in all the noise and shame of that room, had ever established that I'd done a single unlawful thing with them, and walked out the front door into the hard November cold. And the rookie, the young woman with her hat still in her hands, stepped ahead and held the door, and would not quite lift her eyes to mine, and I made a careful, quiet note of her face too. Here is the thing about a man who has chosen a story instead of the truth. He cannot simply hold it. He has to keep feeding it. And every meal he feeds it, he steals from himself. Kessler went back to his desk that same night and wrote his report. He did not have to. He had been told, by then, exactly who I was. A wiser man, or merely a more frightened one, would have written 3 careful sentences and gone home to lie awake. Kessler wrote 2 pages. In them I became a woman acting furtively near parked vehicles, one who had aggressively refused all lawful commands, whose demeanor was consistent with an individual attempting to conceal criminal activity. He wrote that his body camera had malfunctioned in the cold. He wrote that he had used the minimum restraint necessary to ensure officer safety. Every line was a brick, laid carefully, proudly, in the belief he was building a wall. He was building a case. Because a report is a sworn document, and a sworn document that contradicts a silent, timestamped video is not a defense. It is a confession with better grammar. He signed it in a firm, confident hand, with no idea that a high-definition camera bolted above the library entrance had watched the whole thing, and that a manufacturer's server 4 states away had already recorded, to the second, the moment his malfunctioning camera was switched off by a human thumb. He went home and slept, I imagine, quite well. I did not sleep at all, but I was not the one who should have been awake. The first public sign that Bellwether had chosen a road other than the honest one came 2 days later, when a story surfaced in the Elderton Courier under the headline, officer cleared intense library confrontation. Sourced entirely to unnamed department officials and a boilerplate union statement, it described a belligerent individual who had aggressively refused lawful commands during an active prowler investigation and praised the responding officer, also unnamed, for his restraint and professionalism under duress. My name was not in it. My title was not in it. The word judge did not appear in its 14 careful paragraphs. What appeared instead was a fog, deliberate, engineered, low-lying. And I recognized the machinery the instant I read it, because I'd spent my career watching that same machine turn over in courtroom after courtroom. The story had not been written to inform the public. It had been written to build a fortress around Kessler, brick by anonymous brick, before anyone with a camera or a subpoena could reach the gate. But fog is only useful over empty ground, and there's had a witness standing in the middle of it who knew every landmark by name. The union president, a man named Gil Pardo, gave a local radio interview warning darkly against outsiders and coastal elites trying to destroy good working officers over hurt feelings. Then he went further than he needed to. Emboldened by his own microphone, he told the host that this so-called victim had a documented pattern of confrontation with law enforcement, an assertion not merely false but invented whole, sourced from nothing but Kessler's fantasy, and one René would one day play for a jury while asking him, very gently, to identify a single document in that documented pattern. He could not. There was none. He had gone on the public airwaves and defamed a federal judge on the strength of a lie told to him by a man protecting his own skin. I confess I laughed out loud, alone in my kitchen, at being cast as a coastal outsider in the very county where my grandmother had scrubbed strangers' floors for 3 decades. But the laughter did not last, because I understood what the fog was for, and it was not for me. It was for the next black woman on the next set of steps, and the one after her. So I made 2 telephone calls. The first was to René Okonkwo, the finest civil rights attorney I have ever watched work a courtroom. A woman who had spent 20 years patiently extracting the truth from departments that spent decades burying it. She answered on the second ring, listened to all of it without once interrupting, and said only, in her low, steady voice, "Naomi." They picked the wrong person. The second call was harder. I called the state attorney general's office, not as a victim, but as a federal judge with an obligation I could not set down, and told them, carefully and completely, everything that had happened on those steps and in that station. And I told them plainly that I did not want this handled as a favor, quietly, between powerful people who understood one another. I wanted it handled exactly the way it would have been for a woman with no card in her wallet at all, dragged out into the open air and made to stand in the light where everyone could see its face. René's first act was a preservation letter, drafted overnight and hand-delivered the next morning, demanding in unambiguous language that every recording, log, dispatch record, internal message, and email touching my arrest be secured at once and left untouched. Her second act was quieter and far more devastating. She filed a careful series of public records requests that had nothing to do with me. The complete complaint history of Officer Wade Kessler, back to the day he was first sworn in. It took the department 3 weeks and a court order to produce them. And when the pages arrived and the picture assembled itself across René's conference table, it was the picture I had suspected from the moment the steel first bit my wrists. 9 prior complaints. 9. A delivery driver named Marcus, made to unload the entire contents of his van onto a public sidewalk, while Kessler leaned against the fender, unhurried, and found nothing. A 17-year-old girl walking home in the early evening from her grandmother's house, detained on the corner for 40 minutes and never charged. A retired postal worker, 68, slammed against his own garage door over a suspicious person call that turned out to be a report of a man standing in his own driveway. Every one of the 9 complainants was black. Every single one. And every complaint had been reviewed internally, marked not sustained, and quietly buried. Most signed off at the bottom by the same supervising officer, whose careful signature appeared again and again beneath the dismissals. Captain Roy Bellwether. The very man who had reached, so gently, for my elbow to drive me home. While René read those files, Kessler did the one thing that could make them worse. He talked. He was, by his own union's account, confident the facts would vindicate him. And confidence like that does not sit still. He told colleagues in the break room his version of the library, embellishing it a little more each time, unaware that at least one of them was quietly sickened and would remember. He posted, from an account not as anonymous as he believed, a long complaint about activists who've never worn the badge, timestamped, screenshotted, and eventually Exhibit 31. He even called the 17-year-old girl's family, once the record's request became known, to suggest they stay out of something that doesn't concern them. A call the girl's mother wrote down word for word, with the date, because she had learned long ago to record what men like Kessler said to her. Everyone was a spade. He stood at the bottom of a hole he'd dug with his own hands, and kept asking for a deeper spade, and the machine kept handing him one, because in 9 years it had never once told him no. I sat in Renee's conference room a long time, looking at those 9 faces, the photographs she'd laid out in a row, and I did not feel vindicated. What I felt was heavier and far more useful. I felt responsible, because I had been handed, by pure accident of my station, the one thing all 9 of them had lacked, a voice loud enough that the machine could not simply open its mouth and swallow it whole. And I understood, with the same cold clarity that had come over me in the back of that cruiser, that I had no right to whisper. We did not file our lawsuit quietly. Renee and I decided late one night, over 2 mugs of tea gone cold at her kitchen table, that this would not be settled in a back room with a fat check stapled to my silence and a non-disclosure agreement stapled behind it. I had been offered precisely that, of course. The offer arrived almost on schedule. Bellwether's attorney floated a number through Renee, large and comfortable and carefully chosen, contingent entirely on my agreement never to speak of any of it again, to anyone, for the rest of my life. And I told them, through Renee, that there was not enough money in this country to buy the silence of Willis Sinclair's granddaughter about what had been done to her on those library steps, and to 9 people before her. So we filed in federal court, not my court. I recused myself from the entire district that same week, and the case went to a colleague 2 states away, exactly as the law required. We filed under the civil rights statutes, naming Kessler, Bellwether, and the department itself, and attached, as exhibits for the world to read, the 9 buried complaints, unsealed at last. On the morning the filing became public, Renee held a press conference on the courthouse steps in a plain dark coat, and she did not talk about me. She talked about Marcus and his van and the stranger's groceries watching him from the sidewalk. She talked about the 17-year-old girl, now 19, made to stand on a corner in the cold for 40 minutes for the crime of walking home. She talked about the 68-year-old postal worker who had worn his uniform with pride for 40 years and been treated like a burglar in his own driveway by a man half his age. And only at the very end, almost as an afterthought, did she mention that the 10th person, the one whose card had finally made the machine visible, happened to be a sitting federal judge, said not as the headline, but as the footnote it deserved, because the story was never truly about me. These, Renee said, are the racist stories this country tells itself no longer happen. And the only reason you are hearing this one at all is that this time, the woman on the steps had a title. Imagine, she said, and let the silence sit. All the time she didn't. Discovery is where the fog burns off. It is the part of a lawsuit the public never sees, and the part that decides everything. The slow, grinding months in which sworn testimony and preserved evidence are laid side by side on a table until the truth has nowhere left to hide. And it was in Discovery that Kessler's chosen story began, quietly at first and then all at once, to come apart at the seams. It began with his own body camera. Kessler had claimed in his report that the device had malfunctioned, that the November cold had drained the battery, that the footage was simply, tragically, unavailable. An act of God and weather, the oldest excuse in a very old book. But Renee had done her homework, and she did not subpoena the footage. She subpoenaed the device's internal metadata directly from the manufacturer, the invisible log that records every time such a camera is powered on, off, or tampered with, timestamped to the second, indifferent to anyone's story. The camera had not malfunctioned. The battery, at the time in question, had been at 71%. And the log showed, in a timestamp that could not lie or be argued with or be charmed, that the unit had been manually powered down at 8:11, 3 full minutes before he cuffed me, by someone deliberately holding the power button for a slow, purposeful count of 3 seconds. He had turned it off on purpose. He had reached down and switched off the eye of the state before he did the thing he did. And here is the part that still, all these years later, takes my breath. At his deposition, before Renee revealed the metadata, she gave him room. She asked him, mildly, for separate times, in 4 different ways, whether he was certain the camera had failed on its own. And 4 times, under oath, on the record, with his own lawyer's hand twitching toward his sleeve, Kessler looked her in the eye and said yes. He explained the cold. He explained the battery. He grew almost warm about it, expansive, the way he'd been in the front seat of his cruiser, a man who believed the silence in the room was the silence of people believing him. He built the lie 4 stories tall. Then Renee slid a single sheet across the table, the manufacturer's log, and asked him to read the line at 8:11, and to explain how a battery at 71% holds a power button down for 3 seconds by itself in the cold. There was no explanation. There has never been one, and there never will be. What he had not known, what men like him so rarely know, was that the library itself carried a high-definition security camera above its entrance, angled down at the granite steps, and it had recorded the entire encounter in crisp, silent, merciless clarity. My open hands, my level face, my body turning slowly without a trace of resistance, and his, contorted with a fury no reasonable person could mistake for procedure. When Renee played that footage across the deposition table, without a word of narration, the department's lawyers asked for a recess. And I watched Bellwether stare at the flickering screen with the exact expression of a man watching his own house burn to the ground with everything he owned inside it. But the single moment that broke the whole case open did not come from any camera. It came from the rookie. Her name was Officer Danny Reyes, the young woman who had stood frozen in the booking room with her hat in her hands, who had held the front door for me and could not lift her eyes to mine. She had been in the library lot that night as Kessler's assigned backup, and the department had named her in its own account as a corroborating witness to my combative behavior. When she was deposed, under oath, her own union representative and the department's attorneys on either side of her, Renee asked one simple question, gently. Officer Reyes, in your own words, what did you observe that night? There was a silence Renee told me afterward seemed to stretch on and on. I was not present. Witnesses are sequestered. But Renee described it later that evening, her voice low with something like reverence. How the young woman looked down at her own 2 hands folded on the table, then looked up and said, in a voice that shook and then, sentence by sentence, steadied into something like iron, I observed a woman returning library books get handcuffed for doing nothing wrong. She never resisted. She never once raised her voice. And afterward, Officer Kessler told me to write it up like the others. He said the judges around here believe whatever we put in the report. I have been afraid to say that for weeks now. I'm not going to be afraid of it anymore. Danny Reyes ended her career in the Elderton Police Department with those 4 sentences, and she knew exactly what she was doing, and she said them anyway. And when the department, in a fit of precisely the vindictiveness she'd just described under oath, moved to terminate her in the weeks that followed, Renee filed a whistleblower action on her behalf within 72 hours, and I made a private vow that night that whatever else happened, that young woman would never for one day regret having told the truth. Because that is what the machine relies on above all, that the decent people trapped inside it will be too frightened to open their mouths. And every so often, once in a very long while, one of them isn't. And when that happens, the whole vast edifice trembles on its foundation. The trial lasted 9 days. I have presided over hundreds from the bench and thought I understood them completely, but I had never understood, in my own body, in my own chest, what it is to sit at the plaintiff's table and wait for 12 strangers to decide whether the account of your own life is to be believed. The defense did what the defense always does. They dressed Kessler in his formal uniform, every ribbon aligned, every button gleaming. They put him on the stand and invited him to speak about the dangers of his work, the split-second decisions, the string of prowler reports he insisted, even then, had justified all of it. And for a while it might even have worked. He was practiced now. He was calm. He had told his story to himself so many hundreds of times that he had come, I believe, to genuinely believe it. But then Renee rose. She did not shout. She did not badger. She did not perform. She simply walked him, gently, minute by minute, through the metadata log of his own camera. She asked him to read the line at 8:11 aloud, to the jury, in his own voice. He read it. She asked why a device at 71% had been switched off by a deliberate human hand 3 minutes before he handcuffed a woman he would later swear was combative. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He said the cold. She reminded him, without heat, that he had already told this same jury, under this same oath, that the cold drains a battery to nothing, and asked which sworn answer he would like them to keep. There was no explanation. There has never been one, and every person in that courtroom understood it in the same suspended instant. Then she played the silent library footage for the jury. My open hands. My level face. My slow, deliberate turn. She let it run without a word, watched the jury watch it, and sat down. Then she called Danny Reyes, who did not waver, whose voice this time did not even shake. Then Marcus, and the girl who was 19 now and sat very straight, and the retired postal worker in his good church suit with his hands folded in his lap, and one by one they told their long-buried stories aloud in a room where, for the first time in any of their lives, someone with authority was required by law to sit still and listen to every word. And last of all, she called me. I told the truth plainly, the way I have asked 1,000 witnesses to tell it from my own bench. I did not embellish. I did not weep. I said what happened and what it had cost, and when the defense attorney asked, with a thin sneer curling at the edge of his voice, whether a woman of my exalted station hadn't simply been inconvenienced for a few minutes, I turned in the witness chair, looked directly at the jury, at their 12 ordinary faces, and said, I was not inconvenienced. I was taught, at 51 years old, on the steps of the very library my grandmother first walked me into as a small child, that no title I will ever hold in this life is heavy enough to protect me from a man who has already decided who I am before I open my mouth. The only difference between me and the 9 people who came before me is not that it did not happen to them. It happened to all of them. The difference is that I had the means to make you look at it. That is all. That is the entire difference. The jury deliberated 6 hours. When they filed back in, not one so much as glanced toward Kessler at the defense table, and I have sat on the bench long enough to know in my bones exactly what that means. The 4 persons stood, a woman with gray hair and steady hands, and read the verdict, for the plaintiff on every count, $830,000 in damages. I did not celebrate. I closed my eyes at the plaintiff's table and thought of my grandmother's hands, cracked and strong, and how they had folded my own small hands around the idea of composure like it was the only inheritance she had to leave me. It was, and it had been enough. Justice, when it finally moves slowly, and it moved slowly here, the way real change moves, in proper order, at its own stubborn pace. The verdict was not the end, but the beginning of the accounting. Over the 14 months that followed, an independent investigation opened into every one of the 9 buried complaints. The Attorney General's office pursued the false statements in Kessler's sworn report. A federal consent decree was negotiated, argued over, and finally entered, tearing out the department's complaint review process by the roots and rebuilding it under oversight that answered to no captain. Roy Bellwether, whose careful signature had buried 9 truths at the bottom of 9 pages, retired under circumstances the newspapers at last described with no fog at all. Gil Pardo lost his union post over the interview he could not defend, and Wade Kessler, after his own words were read back to him under oath, lost his job, and then, before a state board, in a hearing that took the better part of a year, lost his certification so that he will not wear a badge again anywhere in this state as long as he lives. None of it was quick. All of it was earned. I will not pretend the wheel turned faster than it did. I will end where it began. The following spring, a year and a half, near enough, from the cold night a man decided he knew who I was. They held a small dedication on the granite steps of the Elderton Public Library for a new reading room just off the main hall. It was funded by the award, every dollar of it, and it bears my grandmother's name on the door, the Willis Sinclair Reading Room. I stood on the exact step where the steel had closed around my wrists, in a plain jacket, no robe, no title on display, and I did not need one. Marcus was there, in a good chair now, on the funds board. So was the postal worker in his church suit, gravely proud. So was Danny Reyes, in her first year of law school at 31, who held the front door open for the line of small children filing in with fresh library cards clutched in their careful hands. The same door she had once held for me, because she could not yet meet my eyes. This time she met them and smiled, and I smiled back. And on the pavement below, where a cruiser's headlights had once thrown our two shadows across the asphalt like accusations, there was nothing now but children's chalk and the long gold light of an ordinary evening. The loudest voice in a room almost never wins in the end. Composure is a currency no badge can confiscate. And the only thing worth doing with a wound, once it stops bleeding, is to turn it into a door and prop it open for everyone coming up the steps behind you.